Next from Chicago, our contributing correspondent Jeff Berkowitz talks with former presidential economic advisor Austan Goolsbee. Professor Goolsbee, who is now with the University of Chicago, talks about the lagging economic recovery and what public policies can create greater employment and growth. This runs about 30 minutes.
You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. And we're going to be doing lots of political economy this evening because we're blessed to have Austan Goolsbee. Austan Goolsbee, everybody would know, is the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. He's kind of a whiz kid. He's not yet 43. He was, not yet 43?
43, yeah.
Just 43, okay. Right around the same age that JFK got elected president. So you got that in common.
Right.
Yale undergrad, right?
Mm-hmm.
Got his master's degree in economics at the same time as he's got his bachelor's. 4 years later, a PhD from MIT. A pretty good school. I would say one of the top 5. Is it slightly below the economics department at the University of Chicago, or would you guys say you're?
I don't know. We'd like to think it is, but you know, it depends what field you're in.
All right. So, but more seriously, he is noted for what he did because in 2004. Austin may not remember this, but I met him briefly when you were down working with Barack. He was running in the Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate. You were one of his perhaps first economic advisors. And
I was the only one he knew.
He was the only one?
I was, yep.
He was a little worried. I know he said to Michelle he was a little worried because she didn't have one of these Tweety sport coats.
Yeah, he thought I was a 65-year-old with a beard and a and a pipe.
Obviously, he made the right impression because you started out with Barack on the chair as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors when he was elected in January, or he was inaugurated in January of 2009. You were there for 30 months. The last 10 months you were chairman, I think, of the Council of Economic Advisors. You were there at the creation, and so people would look back and say, well, one thing they think about, okay, we'll get to a number of topics here, but I think one thing that comes up is the unemployment rate right around the time you came in was right about 7%, maybe 7.5%. What was it? Something like that?
Shooting way up.
Shooting up. And you guys said, see, we're going to have some tough questions for you today, because some people would say, remember that Barack said adopt his stimulus program, and I'm sure you had something to say about that. Adopt his $800 billion stimulus program, and unemployment won't go above 8%.
Not exactly.
And it went to like 10%.
Yeah, that is not exactly how it was. But
it's not. But
in the
most
fall
important thing
of 2008, Christina Romer and Jared Bernstein made a forecast of what would be the impact of stimulus. And they had a forecast of here's unemployment with it and here's unemployment without it. Now, at the time, the data on GDP growth, the first estimate said GDP was growing at negative 3.5% a year, which is pretty terrible. Over the next year and a half, that was revised to minus 8.9%. So Christie, Jared, and everyone in the private sector underestimated the depth of the recession in the fall of 2008.
Okay.
So what people do not remember from that, so you can go look up the document, they predicted that unemployment would not get to 9% if you never passed the stimulus. And unemployment was already over 9% before the first dollar of stimulus money ever went out the door.
You're saying
so I think it's a little weird to blame the stimulus.
Well, not blame, but you're saying you're saying the Council of Economic Advisors.
No, it was done in the transition.
No, but the country underestimated how bad things were initially. Is that your point?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Ever the private sector forecasters.
This
was before we were in the government.
Okay.
It wasn't the Council of Economic Advisors.
Right. So economists.
The Council of Economic Advisors, by the fall of 2009, made a forecast of what would the unemployment rate be by the fall of 2012, and they said it'd be 8.1%. So they were totally on.
Taking the big picture, Austan. Okay.
Okay.
The big picture. You're there. You're a trusted advisor. We said Barack knew you back from 2004. It's now 2009. You're not just a guy he plucked out of a university to have the title member of Council of Economic Advisors. This is my perception.
I appreciate that.
Okay, you let me know if I'm getting wrong
okay.
here. Okay, he made Christina Romer his chairman, right?
Mm-hmm.
He made you a member. And who was the other member of the Council of Economic Advisors?
Cecilia Rouse from Princeton.
So you had to be fairly important just because he's comfortable with you, okay? I'm not denigrating Christina or the other member, but he knew you. He would rely on you, right?
Okay.
Sure. These are question marks, okay?
Oh, okay.
Right. So I would think as he's kicking it around, really, should I do a stimulus? I think I should. Brock's kind of a Keynesian. You're a Keynesian. Any Keynesian coming in is going to say, with the economy doing as poorly as it wasn't just a recession.
It's doing epically bad. That's the
epically
worst
bad.
6 months in the history of GDP.
If you're a Keynesian, the debate is not really should you have a stimulus, but how much.
That's
not about
true.
should you have a deficit, but how much, not being worried if the deficit's getting large, because every Keynesian would know, that's what Keynes said, at least many people say, when you got tough times, get yourself big government spending, stimulus, get yourself a deficit, crank it up, and then get out of that, and then you'll worry about what to do to reduce the level of government spending, to reduce the deficit later. Am I getting that right? Basics. Econ 101. Yeah.
Approximately.
Okay. So did you ever have a casual conversation, do you remember early on with Barack, where he kicked around this idea and said, what do you think we should do? Should it be trillion? What should it be?
Well,
how does this work?
December of 2008. So he's
Yeah.
elected. They have the transition. It's here in Chicago. They've named all of the heads of the, Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, Paul Volcker, the various people. Everybody comes to town, and we have the first big economic meeting at the GSA building downtown. We have a big snowstorm that day, so all the Volcker, Summers, all those guys had to take the L to get to the meeting because you can't get a taxi.
Right.
So at that meeting, each person's job is to talk about one part of the economy. So I go through housing. I say, look, house prices are already down 20-25% from their peak. They may go down another 15%. We got $700 billion of negative equity, tens of millions of people underwater. This is going to be a catastrophe. Christy Romer says the GDP is growing at negative 3.5%. Turns out it's even worse, but this is going to be the worst recession since 1929. It's going to take the biggest stimulus in U.S. history, even as a share of the economy, and that's where I first hear the number $800 billion. Previous to that, if you remember, people had been saying in the summer $100 billion. As you had Lehman weekend and people started saying, ooh, it's going to be bad, people were using $200 billion, and somebody had said $400 billion. That was the first time that I heard $800 billion. I think that's around the magnitude that it ended up being.
All right, so there weren't too many people pushing for more than $800 billion. It was the impetus of
Yes.
realizing how bad the economy was that was pushing up
Yes.
from low numbers like $100 billion, $400 billion, up to the $800. Am I getting that right? Okay.
Yes, and that was taking place over a course of a few weeks. So at the end of that meeting, I go to the president-elect, and I say, look, that had to be, it was epically bad background
This is
briefing
now a personal
for the president.
conversation
Personal
between you and Barack.
conversation.
Okay.
And they'd gone through the financial system and how many of the banks do we think are insolvent and they might collapse, and is there enough money in the TARP? Is the TARP going to work?
Right.
I go up to the president-elect and I said, that's got to be the worst background briefing that the incoming presidents had since 1932 with Franklin Roosevelt, or maybe since Abraham Lincoln in 1860.
Worst meaning?
Meaning, look at the conditions. This is horrible. There wasn't a single happy thing.
Briefing in terms of informing him
Yes.
what was going on. Bad
Yes.
in terms of bad news.
Informative about how bad the news was.
Okay.
And the
All right.
president-elect says, Goolsbee, that's not even my worst briefing this week.
Is that right?
Yeah, so-
Did he tell you what else was?
No,
bad
it
news?
was we had Pakistan
Foreign policy,
and the terrorists
okay,
and
so-
this, and you do
Did
not
he
want that
smile
guy's
when he
job.
said that to you?
Not really.
Not
He was
really.
being
Wasn't he
totally
just-
serious.
I know.
Yeah. Yeah, it
He didn't
was-
even see the lighter side of this.
that was
He was
brutal.
thinking, what did he get
That
himself
was
into?
brutal,
Okay.
totally.
Okay. So that's the Barack Obama you knew for a long time. You
Yes.
started out on that. But some people would be critical, and this is outside of economics now, back into political economy. The Journal of Political Economy is still here at the University of Chicago, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's
Probably the top academic journal.
JPE, right?
Yep.
All right. And you're of course you're now a professor of an endowed chair, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you've been here since you came out of MIT in 1995. You've
Yep.
been, except for your stint in government, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what is that, like about 18 years now?
18 years.
You're a senior member of the
Yeah.
Are you at home at the University of Chicago? Because people
Oh,
think
yeah.
of it as a bastion of Look, Milton Friedman is almost an icon here.
Yeah, he is an icon.
Free to choose.
I'd say
The essence of
Chicago
Friedman,
has
you read
always
most of these
been
essays? Okay, the
less
essence of Friedman.
monolithic than fully understood by the public. And I feel totally at home. I mean, this is one of the last places on earth where there are libertarians, liberals, conservatives, behavioral economists, everybody, and they're all kind of in the same room, and they all love each other.
In the business
we're
school, that's
engaged.
certainly true.
Yeah.
And I know you're in the business school, not in the economics department, and that's the Booth Business School, right?
Yes.
The graduate department of economics is a little different. Is it a little bit more monolithic, or is that pretty diverse
No, I don't
too?
think so.
It's
I'd say,
okay?
and we go to each other's seminars quite a lot. The field of economics has moved heavily toward data-intensive, little more microeconomic focus than in the 50s and 60s when it was very macro and a little more ideological, maybe.
But it may be coming back. That's because the economies were so good relatively. You didn't have the kind of cataclysmic drop that we had in 2008. You had a recession in 2001, you had a recession in 81, I guess maybe, was it 91 too? So about every 10 years. But relatively, you didn't have anything going back.
Yeah, it was a terrible
right.
recession.
So this may stimulate a little bit more macroeconomic research and activity.
Yeah, it may, but I think it probably, the macroeconomic research, to my mind, is more rooted in data.
Empirical evidence.
Pure theory, yeah, empirical
evidence.
evidence. Because, you know, we've just gotten these huge data sets, and a lot of the exciting work being done in macro is using that.
So, is there anything you would do very differently? Because you had a $700 billion bailout, which was, the precursor was really in the Bush administration, some would say.
Not precursor, I mean, they
It
handed
was.
out the money
Handed
in
out the money.
2008.
So
you mean the bank part, or you mean the stimulus?
no, well, I'm saying, looking back, you're right. The bailout started before Obama was there. I think Obama certainly signed on to it as a candidate.
The $750 billion of TARP,
right,
was all the money was out the door before Barack Obama
was it really
becomes
out the
the
door?
president.
Was it out
Yes,
the door?
and our whole
Okay.
the
I thought it took a while
canonical
to get some of that out the door.
Look,
No? Okay.
the canonical issue that President Obama's facing coming in 2009 on the financial rescue side is trying to figure out how do you attach more conditions to money that they already have. And the banks are saying, we didn't agree to
Right.
write down
So you can't
principal
really
on
do that.
mortgage. You're not allowed to order. You have to induce them to do it.
Okay. Now, Sam Peltzman, you know Sam. He's
Yeah,
a professor
good friend of
emeritus
mine.
here. You know, he said, finally Bernanke got it right. He was fiddling around with what to do about Lehman, what to do about Bear Stearns, help one, not help one, help AIG.
Right.
According to Penn, he said, he just decided at some point, I'm just going to flood it with credit, okay?
Yes.
I'm just going to flood it with liquidity.
Yes.
And he said that seemed to do it. That seemed to calm things down. I'm paraphrasing what Sam said. Do you agree with him on that?
I agree with the point that if we'd have stayed on the path of we're going to come up with a different policy every weekend, bank by bank, I think that was a very
So that kind of removed
devastating.
uncertainty. It showed the Fed was committed.
Yes, though
Bernanke, if he gets to go
the
watch
only
it,
thing I'm
leave for that.
hesitating here is this is not just exclusively a decision being made by the Fed. The TARP's extremely critical in the middle of that.
Well,
that's not just
it's
a
not the
Bernanke
Fed.
decision.
It's also the Congress. It's
Yeah.
also the executive.
Totally.
It's also you
That's
guys
all I'm
behind
saying.
Barack. Yeah. It's But this was a little different in that Bernanke came out. When I learned economics a long time ago, they would talk about a very independent Fed. And the Fed was structured to be more so. These guys were there for a longer period of time. It's now renewed every 4 years. But as I recall, the chairman be there
Not
14
exactly.
years. Well,
Yeah.
the simple point I'm trying to ask and see if you agree
Yeah.
is that some change in 2008 through 2012, the Fed was more closely aligned in setting policy with the Congress and with the executive than in prior two or three decades.
The rescue, the Fed explicitly says, and I think that's the way you have, if you're going to go into a massive rescue, the Fed can't be doing things on its own that are basically fiscal policy. That's got to be done with Congress. I think if they had just taken the so-called 13-3 actions, which are the emergency actions of the Fed, if they had just done that without Hank Paulson getting up and saying, Congress must endorse this. I think there would be a great temptation of everybody to turn around and say, oh, it's all the Fed's fault. We never wanted anything to happen.
Okay. Now, would you do any of that any differently? Some have been very critical of the stimulus, saying Barack was...
No, but you're mixing two different things.
No, but I know, but let me just get the question out.
Okay. But
One
you're
aspect,
asking about the stimulus, or you're asking about the financial
No, I'm asking
bailout?
specifically about the stimulus. I was
Okay.
saying the broader package, but let me start with the stimulus. Some have been very critical of that and said he turned that over in terms of how that spending was done, the components. He was there with you and others as to the $800 billion number, roughly.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, this is Congress. This is Nancy Pelosi. This is Harry Reid. They want to do their little patronage, their social... I'm using the
there were
Chicago
no
phrase.
earmarks in the
No,
stimulus,
but people,
obviously.
some would say there wasn't enough, even Keynesians would say, there wasn't enough big picture stuff. There was a lot of piddly stuff. It added up to numbers, but it didn't give you the kind of kick that some Keynesians thought you could have had.
Well,
So
there's
as a political,
there are three major parts.
But as a political economist, because you're around government, you're around policy, you're back in the ivory tower world of the University of Chicago Booth School of Business now, but you've been around this stuff. Do you think he should have been a little bit more hands-on, or should have had people who focused and said, get it right?
The stimulus was three parts.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's because there were three different worldviews arguing over what's the order of the day, what should we do. There was one group that said, this will probably be a rapid recovery, in which case long-lived big infrastructure spending will be a bad idea. The normal critique of stimulus is, by the time you get the money out the door, the economy is already recovering, so it's only inflationary.
So
those people said, make it timely, make it targeted, make it temporary, let's just get it all into 2009.
Quick.
A second group said, no, this will be an extended, long-lived thing. Let's put focus on these infrastructure projects and stuff that'll last 2, 4, 6 years. A third group said, let's just try to get whatever Republicans would want, which means let's do it in tax cuts. So the way they split the difference is they did basically a third of each. About 35% of stimulus was tax cuts. A little less than a third was short-run oriented. A little less than a third was this longer-lived stuff. I think looking back, the tax cuts proved to have less bang for the buck than anybody was predicting at the moment. And I think that's because everybody's in massive deleveraging mode. So you gave them a tax cut, and they didn't go spend the money. They took that money and they spent down credit card debt or spent down mortgage debt. So its impact on consumption growth was quite modest. And I think the short-lived stuff, you would, after the fact, seeing that it wasn't a V-shaped recovery and that the dynamic was totally different than in past recessions, you would shift that stuff to be more longer-lived than on the shorter-lived.
What was the other mistake? If a Chicago economist, as I used to think of Chicago economics, there really were supply-siders before there were supply-siders. They would say, look at the incentive to work, save, and invest. Tax cuts to these people don't mean giving tax subsidies for the number of kids you have, things of that type. They say, let's lower the marginal rate of taxation. People will work more.
It was a payroll
more,
tax cut. The making work.
That was part of it, but if you put more, you did well.
Payroll tax cut and the making work pay credit.
Right. It wasn't across. There were the Bush tax cuts already, but there was no new tax cut that was across the board that said low, medium.
Cutting high marginal tax rates, the evidence is pretty strong, has very modest impact on the economy. The Laffer curve type argument has been largely discredited in the data.
But you would agree some people disagree with that statement. When you say largely discredited, in some minds, some would say...
I'm not going to argue with you about some minds. I'm going to tell you what's in the academic evidence is that case has been examined ad nauseum and in great detail, and I can give you 50 major studies published in the top journals that suggest the Laffer curve is utterly bogus. There is no sense in which cutting high-income rates generate their own revenue.
No, that's the strong Laffer curve. The weak
economic
Laffer curve that I learned a long time ago from this guy, Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Freedom. Always look at incentives. The most important thing he would say in economics, always look at incentives. If you give people a somewhat greater incentive to work, to save and invest, they will do it, whether they're high income, middle income, low income. And
The question is of the magnitude.
the Laffer curve was what you just said. That's the strong Laffer curve. That may have been discredited. But what I've said is the Friedman Laffer curve.
Let us
That's not discredited.
distinguish several things which I think you're conflating together there. First, in the middle of an almost depression, incentives to increase the savings rate would be totally nonsensical and a massive mistake. So there were not incentives to try to get people to stop spending, consumer spending, and save more. That would have been a terrible error. We're already engaged in a massive amount of deleveraging, and that was the root of the big spiral.
I said incentives to save, invest, and work.
Save
Invest.
is a mistake. Work, the Making Work Pay credit and the cuts to the payroll tax are exactly on the point
But they're
of
not
giving
middle income.
incentives to
That's
work.
100,000
They are.
less. That's the payroll
It's-
tax cuts off at around 110,000.
It's 98% of workers getting a marginal tax cut.
The
And
job-
on investment, the tax cost of capital has never been lower. They
The job
extended.
but Austin, with all due respect, the job creators are the people with income above 98,000, not below.
uh,
You know.
Th-
The
this
reason why I
is
say
the-
this is-
this is the high income tax rate drives the economy argument. And all I'll
No.
tell you is, we've looked at this, we the economics profession have looked at this over and over. It's completely not correct.
But what I'm trying to say, and it leads into the next topic, because the other major legacy, I think, of the Obama administration, and tell me if I'm wrong, is Obamacare. It's what did Barack, at least on the domestic level, what did he do about the economy? Was it successful? What did he do about health care? Will it be successful? Foreign policy, another matter. I mean, would you agree with me at least that? We may disagree as to...
I think that's a
efficacy.
major issue, sure.
Okay. And it leads into that because the critics of Obamacare say that program is designed as if people don't understand incentives.
I don't agree with that at all.
Because when you tax people, they're taxing medical device makers as if that will generate revenue, we'll put it in the pie, we'll charge people less for health care, and that tax goes to pay for that. So the pie is,
That
the
is
program
not
is
an accurate
self-financing.
description of the
I have to
program.
simplify because we only have about 10
Yeah,
minutes
but
left.
you
to go.
missimplified.
Okay.
You can
Well,
simplify
then you
it into
correct me.
something that's not true.
That's why we have you here.
That's a
You
problem.
correct me.
Okay. The medical device tax is not even remotely the primary source of funding of what costs there are in Obamacare.
What is the... Some people say it's healthy people. Get more young people in there. They're healthy. They won't cost
That's
very
a
much
significant
early
part,
on.
and
now people are
the
saying they're staying
raising
away.
of
They're staying away
high-
because you designed the program. Not you, but the administration.
If we want to get into the details of Obamacare,
Not in the weeds.
I'm happy to do
not
that.
in the weeds, but on the broad level.
I don't agree with what you just said there. The major source of tax revenue is raising the marginal tax rates on capital income for high-income people. The medical device issue is
Say that one more time.
It raises the pay, it applies the incremental part of the payroll tax on capital income. So it effectively raises the capital gains rate on high-income people.
And do you think that's a good thing if you want more capital to tax capital more?
As
you get less
I
capital
just
if you tax
said,
it?
We've looked at this issue many, many times, and at rates like the rates they are now, which we're coming off of the lowest high-income tax rates really in U.S. history since the invention of the income tax schedule. There's no evidence that in the 2000s, when we cut high-income taxes more than they have ever been cut, that generated substantial economic growth. There's just, that
But
is
isn't
not
the larger
true.
picture? Isn't the larger picture in this country, both on the economic side and on the political side, we're not talking about do we want capitalism or do we want socialism. I think you and I would agree.
Correct.
We're talking about do we want to nudge the
Do
government...
we want the rate to be 39.6 or 43? Something much more mundane.
But put more broadly and less in the weeds, do we want the government to be a little bit more involved in people's lives, or do we want the government to be a little less involved? One other question, then respond. Do we want to design a system so that there are fewer layers of bureaucracy, or do we want to design a system so there are fewer market incentives?
Or do we want to design a system where they skimp on all public goods, or do we want to invest in public goods that history has shown increase the growth
Is
rate.
education a public good?
Yes.
And would you agree that we're spending quite a bit on education and not getting much because we don't have competition in education? We have a system in K through 12 that has local monopolies. People can change their education by moving to another neighborhood, but they can't take their money and say, I'm dissatisfied with this school, I want to go to that school if it's government money. Would you, as an economist, because you know Milton Friedman came up with this idea in 1955, so over, what are we talking? We're talking more than 50 years ago. Before he wrote Capitalism and Freedom, he said, just have some competition. Let the people in Chicago, we spend $15,000 per kid per year on the public schools, let those parents who want to take that money and go to the school of their choice. Now, you as an economist, I think, believe in competition. Wouldn't we be better? Wouldn't we be better off and have a better educated society if we had more competition and adopted a school voucher program?
Well, I know it's a big issue for you.
And Brock and I discussed it very often. And
I would say, as a
Brock.
general matter, I think the evidence suggests competition is good. The rise of charter schools in places where there are more school district choices, those things on average tend to be good. But this is slightly more complicated by the fact that schools tend to be big fixed cost type things. And so if you let just the highest income people pack up and leave, it's not unlike the old cream skimming argument with the phone network.
But they've already done it. Austin,
yes and no.
they leave the city and they go to New Trier. They leave the city and they go to Parker. They leave the city and they go to the magnet schools, to the select enrollment schools. 85% of the kids, as you know, in the Chicago public schools are low income.
The argument that you should be able to take your money and go to private schools, if private
especially if you're
tuition,
a low-income person. If you're a low-income person,
if
that's
private
what I'm
school
focusing
tuition exceeds the ability to pay of the median person, then allowing a voucher just ends up providing a subsidy.
No, if you give we spend $15,000. Just let these low-income parents take their $15,000 and go to their school of their choice. You and I know they can learn how to read for $15,000.
Includes a massive amount of fixed costs. It's not all marginal cost.
Not that much. All right. I don't want to make. Correct. We only have a few minutes left, but I was trying to crystallize in this program, and we hope you'll come back. We hope you'll come back. The big themes that people kind of get lost in. What do you think? What am I missing? What are the big themes?
Look,
you were there for 2.5 years. What is the big theme
facing the country now? We've gone through a period of great turmoil and partisanship, but I think a lot of that is due to the fact that it was such a horrible recession. And really, if you look at all countries where they've had financial crises and recessions, the politics gets very ugly for some period until people kind of sort through what just happened to us and whose fault was it. I feel like we're getting past that. And now the question is, what's step 2 facing the economy? What do we need to do? And I think the debate is between, do you want to maintain very low tax rates, understanding that to do that will involve heavily squeezing programs that you currently understand and think that you're going to get. On the entitlement side, it would mean substantially less Social Security and Medicare than people think they're going to get, would mean substantially less education, funding, investment in infrastructure, all of that kind of stuff. And on the other side, if we want the government to spend money on that type of thing as the population ages, then tax rates are going to go up. And you could do with some combination of those two, or you could do one or the other, but basically collectively we got to decide that. I think that's what the next 10 years are going to be about.
Thank you so much,
nice
Professor Austan Goolsbee.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.